Hello, everybody. My name is Mistress Danielle Blunt. I am a New York City-based dominatrix with over 15 years of experience, both working in person and online. And I am thrilled to be here today with Mistress Trinity for another episode of my Maybe podcast, Can I Be Blunt? And Trinity, I would love if you could introduce yourself.
Yes. Hi. My name's Trinity. I am a professional dominatrix and content producer in New York City of 8 years now. And yeah, that's about it.
I like to start with this question. Could you tell a little bit about how you got into this career? I feel like will be a bulk of our conversation with both of our backgrounds in photography and domination. So I'm super curious, like, how you found yourself doing this and like sticking with it.
Yeah. Well, it kind of is interesting because I do think it all kind of ties together. Because my first real exposure to sort of the idea of professional domination was through seeing Nick Broomfield's documentary Fetishes. I think I saw it when I was about 16 years old, which is probably way too young to be seeing it. But kind of that was so fascinating to me. And it just like really always stuck with me. And then eventually later in life, when I moved to New York, I actually did end up starting at Pandora's Box in its current kind of era. In the time in between, I had kind of dabbled with doing some fetish type work off of Craigslist like that. Like many of us kind of started that way. And then when I got to New York, I was here to attend film school. And like many college students, I needed a job that was not traditional hours where I could make a little bit of money. And I just kind of started looking on Craigslist. Back then, it was in 2014, I think, Craigslist really was the place where I feel like a lot of sex workers early in their career would kind of figure out how to get into this world. And there was a listing actually, I didn't start first at Pandora's. I started somewhere else, which was a bad situation. I was only there for like 2 days and then I left. I don't really count it, honestly. And then when I remember the second day I was leaving that place, it became very clear to me that it was a very predatory environment that I couldn't stay in. And I remember as I was like walking out, I called Pandora's Box and asked for an interview. And it's funny because I think I must have the universe had some divine plan for me, because I've heard so many people gripe about the pains of trying to get an interview there, trying to get hired there, but it really just fell into place for me. And yeah, it's interesting because I do feel like, my first exposure, the reason I knew the name Pandora's Box was because of this documentary. And it just kind of led me into that place. And then I kind of just fell down the rabbit hole of the whole world and really fell in love with the practice of BDSM as a profession. I had played around in my personal life previously, but I think any of us on this side of it know there's a whole different character to sort of a professional practice around this kind of play.
And I think one reason I'm like super excited to chat with you is I think that there's something like so both like eloquent and elegant about your branding, and like so precise that I like before I knew you, I was like, I know she's a filmmaker, like I know that you are like your background has to be in photography or videography. To be like consistently producing that like high caliber level of content. And I think there's something like beyond like technical expertise, which you clearly have, that like really captures what it feels like to be in that headspace, and like captures like the feeling of material in a fetish way, which I think can be really difficult to translate, especially like when you're just like cranking out, like making content.
Right.
Or just like leaning super heavily into femdom tropes. I feel like you both have like your own femdom style and aesthetic that like carries through your brand. And I guess I'm curious about like your relationship to both like style and fetish, because I feel like it feels rare to me to see a dom engaging in a way with fetish that I'm like, this is your fetish. Like this, like I mean, I don't know if that's true, but you do a good job of like translating it, of like, this is how I see. And I think my background in photography, I like to be like, take photos that like make me feel like what one of us is feeling. And I
Yeah.
feel like that translates so beautifully in your content. And so I'm curious what that is, what that's like for you, or how that relates for you.
Totally. No, I mean, that's such a great compliment, and I really appreciate that sort of observation. And I have a quote pulled up, which is it's very photography school 101, but it's something that I always think about in relation to fetish and capturing fetish, which is Roland Barthes' idea of like the punctum of a photograph. This is a quote from Barthes. And he kind of describes the punctum being an incidental but personal, poignant detail in a photograph, which pierces or pricks a particular viewer, constituting a private meaning unrelated to any cultural code. So, this is something that I feel like, to me, it really relates to both photographing a scene and also just like scene construction and fetishistic sexuality in general, where there is this like often this very sharp and kind of personal point of focus, which I think is something that's necessary to create interesting photography in general. And I also think in terms of documenting sexuality, and actually, I wouldn't even just say fetishistic sexuality. I think sexuality in general, it requires this personal kind of elusive focal point that really kind of breaks open the erotic potential of whatever's happening. So I think, in trying to have a practice, in having a mind that kind of works this way anyway in relation to sexuality, I think it comes very naturally to me to try to zero in on these details. And it's been kind of a very cool, and, I think I didn't really know when I first started documenting more how much it would translate to other people, but it seems like people like it. So so far it's been very cool to see how many people are picking up on that as well.
Yeah, I like what you said about the focal point, because I feel like it's like the same thing that makes a good session, I feel like is
Mhm.
the same thing that's making your photography like stand out, and like that point, that focal point feels translated in a way that I feel like a lot of, I mean, I'll just like, I don't like a lot of femdom content.
Mhm.
I think it's boring. I think it like relies on tropes. This is like no shade to anyone. Like, do what makes you money. Like, do what makes you your bag. And like, I think we all know putting like too much effort into content that doesn't sell that much, like, isn't the thing that's giving back to us financially. So like, this is no,
Demoralizing.
but I do think there's something like, there's something about how you capture your like going abouts in your dungeon that remind me of like how I see kink when I'm in play, because it is very much that like mono focus of focal point. And like when I shoot kink, I love to play with like shallow depths of focus, because that focal point of like what you're obsessing about in that moment, where your focus is, like when you're in that moment,
Mhm.
is so like so focused on something I feel like so small. And like sensuality for me is like, what was that one thing that someone said that like I'll think about on loop, or that like look, or like the way that light hit someone, that like
Mhm.
that's what I think about like when I'm jerking off. I'm like, ooh, that like magic hour light like on that person, like on their lips, like just flawless, no notes,
Mhm.
boom. And like it's so, sexuality is so visual for me, and like not about like what someone looks like, but like how they're like carrying themselves, how they're like translating their desire with aesthetics, how, I mean, lighting does a ton of work for me. um
Totally.
yeah, and I'm curious about like, so there's like fetish in like, you clearly play with latex fetishes,
I
and
do.
I think there's like also like fetishistic thought that feels kind of different, of like that like obsessive desire, that I'm curious if you could talk about a little bit.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think in general, I say this a lot, both in terms of like, I think that one of the biggest luxuries of sort of how my practice as a pro dom has lent itself to creating these very like intentional scenes is in this ability to focus attention. Um, because so often, I mean, I think in the current state of the world and everything, I think most of us reside in a place of being pretty hyperstimulated most of the time. And I think even most modern pornography, which again, this is no shade to anybody, and if this gets you off or you enjoy making this kind of content, that's wonderful. But most modern pornography is also very gratuitous, kind of trying to fit in as many erotic triggers as possible into the same frame and all of this. And I I I don't think there's anything wrong with that, of course, but I don't find it resonates with me personally. And for me, being able to have moments both, in real time or captured that actually release a lot of our attention and allow things to be very small, to me feels very luxurious and is really peaceful for me, and is something that I think I don't get it in many parts of my life. I don't think my submissives get it in many parts of their life. But to have a moment where really the only thing that you're focused on is, the way that latex looks across someone's body, or the way that rope feels on your skin, or, any of these very small details, but letting them be your whole world for a certain amount of time. To me, there's a huge luxury in that. And yeah, to capture that in a frame of film or whatever else, it feels very natural and kind of allows a viewer of that image to also participate in that experience.
Yeah, you feel drawn in the photos, but I love this idea of like focused, like focal point focused attention, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that that totally is the parallel of like being able to be so intimate and so close. And like I often will tell submissive that I'm like, honestly, like what other time in your life are you putting your phone on airplane mode for a few hours and like not constantly checking your phone? Like first, I think that's a therapeutic element about
Yeah.
like what we do and what we offer people, and that chance to like attune to either like another or that like small detail of like the rubber or like hemp or jute rope on your skin, and like falling into that sensation. I don't I haven't like seen too much of your like kink practice other than like what's online, but in mine I bring in a lot of elements of like yoga and meditation and breathing to kind of like narrow in that focal point and like cultivate that space for monotasking, for like cultivated obsession, for worship. And like I feel like what you're talking about is like worship in the truest sense, like not in the like fetishistic sense of like I want to worship you, mistress, but like what
Mhm.
happens like when you're on your knees in prayer? What happens like when you go to church and like you can hear like the choir around you and you're like completely transported out of your body and feel
Mhm.
like you are encountering the divine, whether it be like in in a church when you're jerking off like at your dom's feet. But I feel like that um and there are also so many details in religion that like bring about that focal point,
Right. Totally.
that I feel like so I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Well, I think there's a I think I think it's a Simone Weil quote that is just basically, the quote is that attention is the highest form of prayer.
Mm.
Um, I think it's Simone Weil. I could be totally wrong with that, but it sounds like something she would say. Um, and no, I mean, I totally agree. And I'm certainly not an expert in any particular spiritual practice, but I think that moving with a lot of awareness around just the body and mind and how the two interplay with one another, and really following my own. I feel that I follow my own instincts most of the time. I don't really know where I'm drawing from, but I think it's a really enriching experience. And the one thing I would add is that I think also for me, I play a lot with fetishes around objectification. And I think also to be able to allow the submissive and to invite them to actually be able to step out of their personhood and their subjectivity in a certain way really heightens these feelings of being able to release. And obviously all of that is done, it can be loaded to do that. It can bring up a lot of different things, but I think that many of us feel a huge amount of fatigue around needing to exist in our current world where, I don't know, a lot of things are kind of crumbling around us. And to have this space that feels very bounded and hopefully as safe as possible, I think is hugely transformative, both for a submissive and also as a witness to that experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like it's not talked about enough, the um like how moving it can be to witness the space that you're like holding and like facilitating for someone to like do that. And like you mentioned, like even in like holding that space for someone, I'm also engaging in that form of monotasking. It might be my focus might be different,
Yes.
but it is still that like same energy that kind of like feeds off of each other, and I'm still engaged in that space, which is where that is all that I'm thinking about, which is one of the reasons why I just like really like one-on-one interactions and like in-person sessions in a way that just will never translate to how I feel about like online work, because that getting that focal point, that like singular monotasking takes so much more for me without that feedback
Mhm.
from someone else. But yeah, I guess I'm curious about how you would explain your relationship to fetishism and then how it relates to photography and
Hmm.
like doing it.
How am I that's a big question. I mean, I think that, I've always been a person who is very much drawn to visual aesthetics. Since I was a child, sort of art and being able to kind of externalize something has always been just a impulse that I've been driven to. Um, and I think, that just that kind of innate desire to have some kind of record or creation. I don't know, that's just something that's there. Um, in terms of fetishism, I mean, I do think that fetish very much affects, again, just the point of view when I'm holding a camera. I think that I'm somebody that I'm extremely drawn to texture, to, these kind of smaller details of things that we talked about, that I think all of those things really animate and also tell the story of what I'm doing. I think that I'm a big fan of, even some photographs that I share online, you don't have the background of who these people are, what my relationship with them is, but I hope that a lot of it can be inferred just through, physical position and composition, um, all of these kinds of things. Yeah, and in terms of my relationship to fetishism, it's it's honestly hard to make like a definitive statement about my relationship to fetishism because I feel like it's something that is kind of a constant. It's very much like a constant evolution, which is part of what I like about it. I think that there's a way that, you know, I think fetishism for me allows for a lot of surprise and it kind of asks for a close attention to things. And, in that attention, there's a lot of potential to be surprised. Like I remember even a few years ago when I was kind of getting more and more into rope bondage, I remember like I've always enjoyed bondage. It's always been kind of a central part of my practice. And when I started learning more and more um, about tying, I remember the really distinct feeling of starting to kind of crave and really enjoy just like the smell of jute, the way that it sounds when it tightens, like these little things. I think I've always been somebody that material is something that I think about a lot. And when I've had more of a deliberate fine art practice, has always been something that, there's such an amazing sensuality between how bodies and materials can interact. So yeah, I think for me, fetish again is I think I've, at this point in my life, played through a lot of things and explored a lot of different things. And what I try to do is just keep a really open mind and allow myself to notice these details as they come up.
Yeah, I think that's lovely. I feel like I'm curious if there's a relationship to you about voyeurism, which is something
Mm,
that I've definitely felt. So like I love to incorporate photography into play. There's something that feels very natural about like my style of domination and having a camera. I'm not totally sure if it's like objectification and like being able to like like aggressively like pose somebody and like bring them into the position
mhm.
that I want them in to like convey what I'm wanting to convey in the image. Yeah, my experience of like coming up in leather community where I was training in like this old guard leather chateau, which I feel like my foray into pro doming came from a pretty different route than a lot of
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I found the lifestyle first, and then I like worked my first job in production. I was like, absolutely not. Am I working like 80 hours a week for like this little pay? Like I cannot
It's
physically do it.
real.
And then I was like, oh, like a couple of hours and I made the same amount I made in the month. Like that seems much more my speed. Um, I guess so, yeah. But I came to it from a very lifestyle space where I was like exploring it in my own sexuality first. And when I was at the leather chateau, I like wasn't always the most, I was like not always the most comfortable. And so
Mm-hmm.
while I was there while I was studying photography, and so I would bring my camera out and I would take photos and I would kind of like disappear into the background and like indulge my voyeurism and like kind of like take all of these snapshots of like it was such an interesting space because it like they called it a chateau, but it was like definitely kind of like a double wide place that was just kind of like transformed by like mostly the energy that
Right.
that was in the space. And so there were all of these like this dichotomy of some of these like really sensuous and like gorgeous elements with
Mm-hmm.
some of these just like more like everyday life vibes, and was really interested in that transformation and like transcendence
Mm-hmm.
of those materials into like what makes them otherworldly. But I definitely think for me in my relationship to photography, there is like I like to watch more than be watched, which I think is I feel like people are always surprised when I had a dom be like, "Oh, a socially awkward dom." Like, that, what a surprise! I'm like, really? Like, are we not all? Are we not all secretly that way? Okay. Um, but like getting to hide behind the camera and kind of like play that way has always felt so natural to me. And like I've also done a bunch of feminization play is a really big part of my practice, gender exploration play. And I still do offer photo shoots for
Mm-hmm.
people during transformation sessions, and we'll do like a boudoir photo shoot, which has been really, really fun. And there's something, I think, like the power dynamic between photographer and subject is something that's really fun to play with. It can both be like objectifying, kind of humiliating, kind of like very aggressive. All of my submissives tell me that I'm like my most sadistic when like I'm teaching them to take photos of me and like, no, like this, like you can't fucking do it. Um, and I get very cruel in that instance when I'm not the photographer. But I think there's something about the power dynamic of photographer and
Mm-hmm.
subject that I think is really fun to explore within a DS dynamic. Like, especially like I feel like so much of what we explore in kink is about different power dynamics that exist in real life and that may have impacted us in a certain way.
Right.
And just like whether through personal experience or through like just seeing it in media. And I think the the like history of like how extractive and exploitative photography can be. I'm thinking of like National Geographic
Mm-hmm.
features and things like that, where white photographers are parachuting into cultures and just like extracting, and there's no gain for the people who are the subjects of that content, or like non-sex working photographers who come in and take photos of us and then sell them. I can't think of this photographer's name who like screenshotted someone's Instagram and sold it for like
Oh
a,
yeah, yeah, yeah. I know who
a,
you're talking about.
a bunch of money, and like as if that was the art and that she
Yeah.
was not. And I think about this a lot, especially I feel like the more visible I am, the more I see people taking things
Mm-hmm.
from me. There's recently a book that was published, and there's like 50 pages of the book that's about a scene that I did on Zoom during the pandemic. Like, just straight out, no acknowledgement, no attribution. I know that the author was like there. And I think that relationship is fun for me to play with, like having been in that situation and like had
Yeah.
things like extracted in that way, being able to like play the role of the like extractive photographer, and just like getting what I want out of it is also really fun. And I feel like there's a question in here somewhere, but maybe it's something like as broad as like how do you like in what ways do you incorporate photography into your play? Because I feel like it's very different to like we are making a photo and like I am bringing this camera into this session as an extension of my body to like add to this erotic experience that
Mhm.
we are sharing, and like it can look like a variety of different things. And so I guess I'm curious how when you are photographing in a session, like what that may look like and like what that feels like to you as a dom.
Yeah, I have so much to say in response. So, one of the first things that come to mind, especially when you're talking about, different power dynamics and kind of different subject positions between a photographer and a model or whatever, these things are. I mean, one of the things that I've always felt is hugely um, appealing and kind of liberating for me in kink is that there is a understanding and a consenting into two parties having an intimate experience, but with very different experiences that each of them will have. And this distance is actually like allowed for, accounted for, and it's not a failing on either part to connect. It's actually sort of the what's baked into the experience, and allowing that sort of divide to create tension and drama is something that, I've often been kind of I've often felt in my life that it's a shortcoming of mine, that I sometimes have a harder time connecting with people, and to be able to actually have this allowed distance has been something that's actually brought me so much closer to so many different people. And yeah, and then I think that the kind of the idea that you bring up, that's kind of this normative framework for understanding photography, that like the camera is sort of this tool of domination or exploitation of its subject. I always think about when I was in college, I took a world religion class, and I remember a student in the class, I wish I remembered their name. I could attribute this somehow to them. I really have no idea. But I remember they brought up this idea that submission to God, like to want to submit, right, is kind of one of the most transgressive and challenging things within a world that so values power and domination, and that having like an aesthetic practice can actually be this way of really undermining whatever power dynamic it might be, whether that's patriarchy, capitalism, whatever you want to talk about. And that has always stuck with me, in that, there is something very taboo about desiring submission, because our world places so much stock on being powerful, on being able to dominate. So I find that there's something very beautiful about being able to capture people in this kind of vulnerability and have it be something that does bring them a sense of being seen in a deeper way in this moment of transgression or vulnerability, whatever it might be. And then I think, too, another thing that I think about a lot, particularly with most of the people that I work with who are either in my photographs or videos, are almost always hooded and their identities are not shown. And I think a lot, too, just about the this kind of, again, almost it ties back to this idea of objectification, but this removal of our legible identity, our legible face, which now is through these digital means completely tied to our legal identities and all of these things. I think that, like, I love to think about the way that, BDSM photography can almost be this liberation from extremely heavily surveilled photography and stuff like that. And this way that being masked, literally having your literal sort of face taken out of the frame, can actually be such a liberating experience, and allow to be captured in a much more kind of, I mean, I don't like the word authenticity because I think it's really loaded, but it can allow you to be captured in something of a more authentic or kind of released state where you're a little bit less self-conscious.
I love that. I study surveillance technologies, and I love the idea of GIMP as anti-surveillance.
Oh,
Something to
really?
continue thinking about.
Absolutely. And I mean, I remember I wrote a paper about this in college, actually, about kind of like removal of identity in film as like this way that characters access different potentials within themselves. Because I think we all have a lot of stories that we tell about who we want our kind of legal identity to be. And I do think that, in, wearing a latex mask and allowing your body to be proportioned differently with a corset, whatever it might be, there is this way that you can step outside of this very narrow and prescribed identity that you have to live up to.
There are some fun articles about like juggalo makeup and drag as anti-surveillance technologies that like used to be able to fool facial recognition technologies, which are very fun. But I think there's something really interesting with the first of all, I think masks and like blindfolds are an incredibly powerful tool in BDSM because I do think they like give that feeling of surrender so incredibly powerfully and so incredibly quickly, where you're like no longer thinking about yourself, you're no longer thinking about what's around you. When you're unable to see, often your other senses will kick up into a heightened state, so that the sounds that are around you, the smell of jute, the like smell of your mistress's sweat, the like clanking of like her heels on the dungeon ground, those are the things that are like really bringing you into that deeper subspace. And I think the like it's like for me it's like both the removal of identity that can be incredibly powerful, as well as like the removal of sensation, and removal of the senses, and being able to play with those two things combined I think are really powerful. And then it's like both like taking away someone's sight, stepping in and like documenting that vulnerability, and then being able to share those images with people afterwards, I feel like have incredibly transformative potential. And just like you were saying, I completely agree with you. Like society, there it's so taboo to like accept and welcome submission if you're not like a housewife. It's not, I mean, even for housewives, it's like, is that even being rewarded for you? Is this benefiting you? And so I think there are so many ways that we're taught to not embrace those aspects of ourselves, and that you have to fight against, and then it can become like an incredibly vulnerable thing to accept that role. And like the way you talk about bondage and objectification, of like taking away the responsibilities from someone, of like being a person who exists in society that like has to think about the news, that like has to think about like relationships, and like being able to just be without any of those responsibilities, I think is so powerful. And one of the reasons I love objectification play so much. I was just talking, I have this one submissive who books me for like many hour ignore sessions and is into feet. And it's not like the performative ignoring, it's just such a deep meditative state that he is able to get into, and it's just so incredibly beautiful. And like I've had like doms join me for those sessions who are like, that was so romantic. Like I like don't usually feel that. And like I feel like when someone really just like embraces their fetish and can like lean fully into it as a form of worship, as a form of like obsessive focusing of attention, and like being able to bring like match them as their dom with that like same energy, I feel like is so powerful. And like I don't really identify as a fetishist. I'm like much more interested in power, and then like fetish and obsession as a way to play with power. Yeah, and I'm curious about like what you enjoy about objectification play, as well as like how you feel about like I guess like looking at your content, I would be like put you in more of a fetish category. If I'm categorizing people, I don't know why I'm doing this, but you know, like you make a lot of fetish content. There's also like deep beauty and vulnerability in the like dynamics that you have, and I'm wondering like a little bit about that like relationship between objectification, fetish, and then like like how domination fits into that for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think about this is like a hot button word, I think, actually, in BDSM. Like, I feel like a lot of people talk about ritual in BDSM, and often people talk about ritual, they talk about these kind of really heavily constructed scenes where, you know, there's like this purging, there's this religious element, all of this. For me, when I think about ritual in my practice, it's actually about like repetitive practice, like what it means to just like kneel, put on a collar. You've done that in front of me X amount of times, but like how does the repetitiveness and the sort of practice of physical movement, whatever it might be, how does that kind of trigger mindsets? So for me, I think I have a lot of interest in ritual in that way, which really allows a submissive to drop into a different headspace, and also sort of in observing that, it also allows me to come into my headspace. And I think, I mean, what it seems very basic, and I think about this actually a lot. This is something that Mistress Chiaki said in one of her rope seminars that I've taken, where we were kind of just discussing, like, why. I remember we were doing a Q&A, and one of the students asked, like, why she chose to do one version of an upline versus another, and like what were the practical reasons for this and whatever. And she was very clear, where she just was like, well, the way I do it is more beautiful, so that's why I do it that way. It's not about, both would work fine, but this one is more beautiful, so that's how it's done. And that struck me so much, because I think I had never heard somebody say something so clearly that just related to their own aesthetic sensibility and how they are pleased looking at something. And it really emboldened me to also make choices just due to what I find beautiful and harmonious and kind of peaceful to look at. Which I think objectification, that is something that comes up greatly for me, where, there's something about, putting somebody in full black rubber and just looking at the shine of it, moving my hands over it. It does something to my brain, where I just am able to release into this sort of sensory and aesthetic pleasure. Same with rope, I think does a very similar thing for me. A lot of different types of bondage, really. So yeah, that idea of just actually being able to make choices just because of what you've decided for yourself, what you know to be more beautiful for you. I found that that was a real moment for me. And yeah, I think that kind of, it feels like for me, definitely fetish and being able to feel that I have this sort of agency over somebody to make these choices based on my own sort of rubric of what I have decided for them. That to me is where the power comes in. I mean, I think that, often we talk about fetish and power on two opposite ends of a spectrum in BDSM. That doesn't resonate with me at all. I find them to be very imbricated into one another. And I don't, and I think, I don't know, I think the kinds of people that I tend to work well with have a similar relation, where they do have strong sensory or visual reference points for what is erotic to them, but not so much that it overwhelms the personhood of who they want to be engaging in this kind of play with.
That's really interesting. I feel like I like that quote about because it pleases me. I feel like it's such like a good dom reason for doing things that it's also like that's so subjective, and also like that's what's important, I feel like, for a dom to be like engaging in their dominance in a scene. And I very much, it was hearing your talk was reminding me of a clip I once shot, which was like, honestly, as a joke. I was with a friend who was filming for me, and I like ran out of customs to film, and I'm like, give me like I'm gonna film a custom just for you. My friend, who is like my most like aesthetic friend, she's a designer, she like helps me like design my house, and just like is like so sweet and thoughtful, and like has such an eye for like furniture and interior design in a way that my brain doesn't. I'm like, I know what looks good, but I wouldn't know how necessarily to put it together in the right way. And so we were in this beautiful hotel room in Detroit. I think it's like the Siren Hotel. And she's like, I want you to do like an erotic objectification film about turning me into like an object in this room, of like how beautiful this room is. And I like made this clip called Objective Beauty, where I was just like fondling this lamp and like talking about like the design aesthetics, and like this like portrait of like this nude woman on the wall with this lamp, and like talking about like transforming someone and like magically like turning them into an object in this room, and like an object bring me pleasure and like visually stimulate. And it actually turned into a clip I really liked. I'm like, I don't really know how other people feel about it, but I think they're like it, I feel like for me it got to objectification kind of like at its core, that it's like both taking away your agency, like taking away that sight, taking away that like responsibility of personhood, as well as being able to like impose my desires on you, like
Totally.
aesthetically. And I think for me, it often looks like I have like a section on my website called like human canvases, and I really am into how do I say this on a place that we can share? I am really interested in play that opens the body and a sea of red comes out.
Right.
And like decorating people and like shifting how the body looks with like nylon and rope, and like not for not necessarily for like restrictive bondage, but just like manipulating the body in a variety of ways, adding to the body, like adding flowers to the body, adding like meaningful objects. I'll often have people like bring things that they want to be like incorporated into mummification scenes. And I think that like that power to be able to like turn someone into a canvas is so fun. This is
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you talk about it, because I feel like I almost have a similar but opposite impulse where I think a lot about, this is again a quote that I don't know the attribution to, but the quote that is, perfection is achieved not when there's nothing left to add, but there's nothing left to take away. And for me, like the process of stripping somebody, putting on just like clean looking black rubber to like really make their form as minimalistic as possible, clean rope, simple, that to me, like it speaks to my aesthetic, and this like intense stripping of a person and of a submissive to this very basic moldable state where there's truly nothing left to take away, and anything that is put there is done in such a kind of delicate way. That to me is like the highest expression.
I love that. I filmed some clips with Mistress Roxanne recently, who was working hard to give me a latex fetish. And I really appreciated it.
I was actually going to ask you about that, because I feel like you've had a bit of a renaissance.
I'm having a midlife crisis.
Remember, not to call you out, but I remember you've made some scathing tweets in the past about latex fetishes.
I hate latex, so
I know you do.
I'm very confused sexually right now. I've always admired it. I think latex is incredibly beautiful. I think I also like have a mild latex allergy, and it's like it can be uncomfortable for me.
That'll turn you off, yeah, for sure.
But I'll just indulge my masochism that way.
There you go.
I don't know what happened. I've always enjoyed seeing other people on it, but I like genuinely, it was like one fetish that I like really could not understand.
Totally.
Specifically why doms were into, because
totally.
Roxanne and I filmed a clip of like her helping me get dressed, like us getting dressed in latex and like talking about latex, and like she's like shimmying into her latex, and I'm like, help, like while we're like talking about it, because like I don't know how much lube to use. Totally. And there's something we were talking about, which is like latex often makes me feel very submissive. And the restriction, it feels like I'm in bondage. And I think that's why I don't associate it as much with like my dominant power. But I think that there's like hearing more latex fetishists talk about it, of like, like the way you talk about it, and like having like a barrier, like this like incredibly thin barrier between skin, like being able to transform someone, being able to take away that identity. And I filmed a clip after this, getting into latex, some like sexy shining latex videos where I like femdom POV, like turning someone into like a latex gimp and like taking away their identity. And I like kind of like channeled one of my submissives who I knew would be like super into it. And I'm like, something like unlocked in my brain. I'm like, I'm into it. I got it. But I do think the reason that I'm getting into latex is because you get less flagged on social media for nudity. So that's the primary reason.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's so interesting because hearing you talk about how, this experience, how it feels akin to bondage or something. I, I mean, it totally makes sense, like sensorily and all of that. To me, it's like I've always felt that like being in a body is a form of bondage, and to have this ability,
Head, just
yeah,
like
and to have this ability to like subtly, shape. And again, there's something about latex that sits so in this strange like wrapped around place of like something that feels very natural and skin like, but something that feels very uh artificial, and it's kind of in that horseshoe area
yeah.
between the two. That to me has always felt, yeah, kind of like a liberation from the state of just being embodied with no accent or something.
I feel like that makes sense. If you feel like trapped by the body, adding in like something to like hold you in
Mm-hmm.
even more, like I feel like makes sense. I think it's also just, I think it's literally just, I have been a bitch about latex, but it's mostly like just my personal.
No, I fully support anyone being a bitch about pretty much anything. So
I
I'm
I have I have participated in kink shaming, and this is my formal apology by now acquiring the fetish and humiliating.
that's always the life cycle of a fetish, right? You have to reject and shame
Yes,
first, and then
exactly.
it
I
comes back
really
even stronger later.
it,
Yeah,
before I could like integrate it into
exactly.
my wardrobe.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
it's interesting. I still like. I don't think I feel the same way. Like the way some of my friends describe like when they put it on, but I think like aesthetically and physically it's doing something different to me. I
Totally.
think I also just like have sensory processing issues where I'm like I love
Mm-hmm.
natural fibers, like I can't wear anything that's like
Totally.
a blend with like artificial like material in it. Like if there's a tag on my clothing, I want to like
Like,
get rid of
chill.
myself,
I totally.
like just like yeah, if I have a tag on my clothing, it's gonna be a bad day for me. So like
Mm-hmm.
as soon as I get home, like comfy clothes on, like I have a pile of pants that are like these pants don't make me cry and these pants like are gonna make me cry. So I think that's also just like a personal thing for me, but I think visually it's just so striking, and the way that I feel like latex more than leather can transform in a way that is incredibly powerful. And I think there's also something about like what you're talking about, like sitting at this intersection of natural and unnatural that has so much space for like world building and imagination and like creating like a tabula rasa, like a blank slate to project desire onto, that I think is incredibly sexy. I just did a photo shoot. Well, this is kind of linking both of what we've been talking about. One of my submissives loves that I'm a photographer and has bought me a bunch of new film cameras that we've been fucking around with, and some like gorgeous Zeiss lenses that I am just like so stoked about.
What
And
camera did you get?
I still have my 5D Mark II that's like pretty
Okay.
old. But I have very nice lenses for that camera. And it it's just she's an artist and like a like classically trained like painter and drawer. What is the word? um and like will draw my feet, and like I'll be taking photos, and we just like have these like really fun art making dates that are so fun. And we recently like went to Purple Passion and just bought like a shit ton of latex, and I'm like, I'm going to like completely transform you. And like when it happened, like just seeing that shift in her body was, and like seeing her like come to know her body in that latex, and like had like the hood that just like fits the face perfectly with like only holes for the nose, so it's just like completely anonymizing, and like she couldn't see anything. And I like just had her tits out, stapled them together, and like turned her into a vase, and like used her as a prop for photos that I was just like
Mhm.
taking of myself. And it just like felt so aligned with my style of domination, of like getting to like play in this way that can be like incredibly cathartic, as well as like artistic, and like getting to indulge those like visual aspects of myself that are so fun. And I feel like for me, like femdom devoid of aesthetic is not interesting for me. So getting to play with people who are also really interested in aesthetics is incredibly fun and rewarding.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I think I relate to that, and I think again, to me, again, it's all about that sort of the handing over of control of sort of how things are going to be looking. I feel like it's fun to also like take people who have maybe never been able to see themselves in a way that they really enjoy or that they feel is expressive in a certain sense, and actually like take control over making that happen. It's
Yeah,
fascinating.
I like that. Okay, if you were to deepen my latex fetish, what would you tell me about latex? If you want to
Um,
radicalize me right now,
well, do you have a cat suit yet?
I have one on the way.
Okay, you need a cat suit. I mean, to me, latex isn't. I feel like a really high percentage of the body has to be covered before you understand a latex fetish.
Mhm.
Um, or you could get in a back bed if you're interested.
I think back beds are so sexy.
Yeah, and I think, for me, like one of the most rewarding and like deeply fetishistic experiences I have had with latex is when I'm in like a full cat suit and just get massaged with, latex lubricant and that feeling of just sensation through the rubber and all of that. Um, Especially if you want to experience sort of if you want to feel the sensory piece of it, that's the biggest thing. And you need gloves too. I really feel like coverage is important with latex. I'm a big
I got toe socks, so
good. That's great. That's wonderful.
I feel like
Get stuck on your feet through them. You'll be a convert, I swear.
what was it on
You'll
my
be
feet?
a convert immediately.
I have been in like gloves, socks, no, I guess not catsuit, but like pants and like long sleeve. It was interesting when Roxanne and I were getting dressed. She was helping me with a corset, and I'm like, we're just having two radically different experiences where I'm like, what a service for you to help me get dressed. And she's like, I'm putting you in latex.
Right. Yeah.
Like, wow. It's so interesting how like any of these activities can be done from like either end of the DS spectrum. And I'm like,
Totally.
not on the same page here.
Another thing that I will say that I feel like for me is really profound in a latex session is like the hood that you described. That's like very full coverage of the face, just nose holes open. I get a lot of insane pleasure out of just like looking at somebody's face and that and like massaging their temples, like hearing how their breathing changes with touch, looking at this completely covered face. For me, that's like a huge and very deep experience as well. And like just kind of really taking in this very like anonymized subject that now is like yours to mold in one way or another.
Yeah, I love that. It's like I feel like so much of DS is about taking away of that personhood to like even if it's not like straight objectification, there is that like process of, you know, taking away like that process of like renaming someone with a submissive name, taking away their name. They're stripping away their clothing that they wear. They're leaving their like wallet and their phone and their ties to like their family and their personhood and their job, you know, in the bathroom and like don't have to have that. And I feel like even without latex, it's such a big part of like the ritual
Right.
that happens. And I love that differentiation that you were making between like, we're going to plan a ritual to either traumatize you or maybe exercise some trauma, which I feel like is also like a big part of my style as a dom. I like love those like specific like intentional things.
Totally.
And also a submissive that I trained who's now a pro dom. I've spoken with her about how my training kind of like rubbed off on her and like the things that I do at the start of the scene, from like kneeling at my feet to like the specific breathing to the way that I touch a submissive, is like now a part of the practice. And I think it's like I'm not always, and like like the collaring that you're talking about, and like the stripping, like watching someone like remove their clothing, and like that moment of vulnerability and like moving into a session is both, that ritual is like how I attune to a submissive and sort of like
Totally.
intuit and like can connect and like figure out how to move within the scene through doing the same thing every time. And I think that there's
Yes.
something about like habit obsession and ritual that like doesn't need to be like, this is the ritual of a marriage. Like we're
Right.
getting married and spending all this time and attention on like ceremony. There's like, I guess the difference between like ceremony and like the ritual action of like everyday like devotion and repetition
Yeah.
that for me, just like as a dom, really help to get into that headspace. Because if it's like my morning, my like when I'm good and like have like a daily morning practice, I do the same exact thing every different day, every single day. And if something is different in my body will tell me because I'm doing the same thing every day. So if I have a different response to it, it's like giving me information and intelligence about my body. And I feel that way like when I'm starting a session, if I do it the same way every single time, I'm like getting the information that I need as a dom to like pursue
Totally.
the rest of the
Totally.
set.
Yeah, and I think it's, I think breaking down like ceremony versus ritual is an interesting distinction because I feel like for me, I am I as a in my practice, I am not a planner like at all. I do not plan scenes almost ever. I'll have loose ideas. Like I'm not going in totally whatever, but I really almost always I just again like I have this opener that kind of like you said attunes me to the session. Obviously every time we do it there's different variables, how we're both coming in, whatever else, and then I just go from there. And that's always been my way. Whenever I've tried to plan things, I never stick to it, so I just kind of stopped. So I'm somebody where I feel like ritual is really important to my practice, but I almost never kind of go into this ceremonial place. Um, for whatever reason.
I feel like my ceremonies are often not planned at all. And
Mm,
I feel like my approach to like I don't know what will happen. It's like very intuitive and like starts with like that same ritual of how I would start any other session. But what I will have done is ask them to prepare
mm,
like intention and like what they're bringing into the space. So whether they're bringing like objects, I'll often have people like bring a bouquet of flowers or like a bolt of fabric or like meaningful like stones for them or like things that they want to be incorporated. I have this one submissive. I keep talking about my woman submissives. I do have men submissives sometimes, but not. Um, I've been trying to like say in interviews that I also see men because my branding accidentally got a little bit too queer. And I'm like, I do also see men, I swear. Um, but I have this one submissive who, like, each time we get together is kind of like a ritual, but she is so like devout and service oriented, and
mm,
comes she like in between the time she sees me, she's collecting these objects that's making her think of me. And she is also someone who's like very aesthetic and like aesthetically driven, and like one of the most interesting like way she styles herself that like I've seen in New York. She's like fascinating. And she will come to this session with like this like duffel bag that she's like made of leather, and like I get to keep the bag, and with like all of these like gifts and offerings of things she's made, things she's like acquired, and like while going thrifting that like she thought were visually interesting. And then we'll like move into the session and with like an intention, and then I will get to like use the raw materials that she brought in our like collaboration for the scene. And so I feel like for me, a lot of the ceremony comes from just having people do that prep work and intention setting and like bringing the right things in the space and like maybe something they want to leave behind. But I don't think it necessitates like a meticulous planning. I think I like part of like my magical practice is like largely chaos based. And so I think it's just like setting myself up for success in that way.
totally. Totally. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay, my next question for you is if you were a fascist dictator, what
Oh God.
would people wear? If Trinity had been able to style
I'm
everyone.
sorry. I feel like we're getting too close to fascist dictatorship for me to feel comfortable answering this question. It's like kind
For
of like
me,
not. I understand. Everyone's different. I'm not here to judge, but
I
I
can
have to
reframe
say
the question.
I can't dream of being a fascist dictator.
Okay.
Maybe that's a cop out, but that's my answer.
If you were to style everyone in the world so that they were to look like if you had consent to style everyone in the world so that they would like fit your aesthetic desire, like what would they be wearing? Is my nicer way of framing the question.
Okay. Okay. The thing is, okay, this is a cop out too, but this is something that I have found within myself more and more as maybe I'm taking this way too seriously also. This is like just like a funny question, whatever. But like honestly, when I hear you can style everyone in the world, even with consent, whatever, I'm like, that's a lot of pressure and I don't want to do it. That's honestly how I feel. Um, I don't know. I feel like I like it. I'm in the moment where it really is invited and I can focus. I love it. But when there's too much going on, I'm like, I'm out. I
That's
don't
fair.
need to
I
be
mean, who
involved.
wants to do it?
But I'm
Imagine
starting to feel. I think I easily feel overwhelmed. Maybe.
because it's more of a one.
Yeah,
No,
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a
I don't
one-on-one situation. Exactly.
either. I just thought like I was imagining like an army of like gimps.
Yeah, I mean that would work. Don't get me wrong, that would totally work for me. Yeah, I think I'm taking this question too seriously, honestly.
It's fine. Maybe I can do with my fascism bringing in.
Yeah, that scared me a little bit.
But I mean, maybe it's something to talk about too, right? Like whatever comes up in this space, we can work with. Um, we
Totally.
can work with it. But like, I do think you posted a tweet recently, which I don't know if you remember off of the top of your head, because I'm sure it will be more eloquent than my
Mm-hmm.
paraphrasing, but about like playing with power dynamics the way that we do as DOMs being
Yeah.
like very bananas right now in the time of
Mm-hmm.
um like multiple ongoing genocides that aren't like not happening at other points but is incredibly visible on social media in a way that I think is definitely newer. And just the coverage is shifting very radically in the last
I
six
feel like
months or
all
so.
of our platforms have been kind of collapsed into one thing, right? It's like
Yeah.
there's something very, very strange about, the same place that people are sharing information about protests, news, whatever else, being the same place that, you're supposed to be marketing yourself. And with the sort of current state of ad sites or alternative places to, kind of engage specifically with what we do, it's all collapsed into one thing, which I think is wouldn't be my first choice. I'll say that.
Yeah, definitely.
Totally.
No, but I do think it is. I think I tweeted about this like 6 months ago when I feel like things were escalating. Um, just it is also so I don't know. It's so interesting seeing people who play with power dynamics in the way they do, like not seem to have that understanding of how and where what we're playing with comes from, and like how abuses, like state level abuses of power, take place. And
Totally.
um I think it's something as people who like play with power in the way we do, it's like all in our service to like continue educating ourselves and continue um learning both about like history as well as like like we're talking about aesthetics. It's like, where do these aesthetics come from? Like, where does the worship of black leather boots come from? And
Yep.
also, this is a hill that I will die, but like, why don't American Nazis dress better? I'm sorry, but like, no style. Like there's nothing to eroticize here.
Mm-hmm.
Um, sorry, this is the tangent my brain goes on. But like I think like even when we are not like expressly playing with versions of state violence, like even
Right.
like we're not doing like a cop role play, there are still elements of like like police fashion evident in how dominatrices style themselves. There is still, even if you're not wearing a swastika, there are elements of like Hugo Boss's like a creation of the Nazi uniform that are evident in how doms style themselves. Even if you are not playing with race play, some of the tools that we are using come from slavery. And I think not talking about that, I feel like does a disservice to like how deep and transformative expressions of consensual power dynamics can be.
Totally. And I think, one thing that I was kind of getting at with the tweet that I put out, and I'm just going to preface this by saying perhaps I feel this way because I am not somebody who is submissive. Like, I really don't ever hold that role. But I think intellectually for me, there's something that I can really square about asking to give up power in certain ways and how that can really, within a container, be very cathartic and fuel a lot of catharsis and be this great release in this space where you can kind of safely explore these things. There's something to me that, even though I do it every day, is hard to square about what does it mean to ask for power and why do we want that? And why is it something that is a craving and is a pursuit? I think that, there's a lot of amazing texts out there about this. Like, I'm not the first person to think through this or ask these questions, but I think that, wanting to replicate some elements of this kind of like psychodrama of power, which all of us as human beings experience daily in varying degrees. I just find it to be a question that I don't necessarily have an answer to at the moment. And that feels, I feel that I trust myself and I trust the people that I play with to, I know that we are creating something good. I can feel it between us. And if there are steps off of that course, then we will correct them responsibly. But I think that it's an interesting question. And, I think again, within kind of traditional femdom conversations about this, there's so much kind of discourse about like, inverting this heteronormative narrative or whatever. But I also think, again, at least for myself as a white woman, it's like, what does that mean to really like step into, like, why and how is this like fueling me? I don't know. Again, I don't really have answers, but it feels like it's getting more and more confusing as time goes on. And it's not to say that it's something that I want to it doesn't make me want to step away. It actually makes me want to step closer and kind of continue to see how intimacy can be built through these channels and we can learn through doing within trusted boundaries.
Yeah. I think there's something that you mentioned earlier about like the distance allowing you to be closer to that I feel like is also relevant for me of like there's something about DS dynamics. Well, first I think it's like your question is a really important like self-reflective one and I don't know that I totally answer, but I think part of my answer references what you were talking about earlier about like that level of distance actually allowing more intimacy and vulnerability because it's moving at the speed and the rate and the control that you have. I'm speaking
Mm-hmm.
for myself right now, that you feel that like one feels comfortable with. And I think that there was something that like when I found kink and I found this like leather house that I felt so comforted by. I'm neurodivergent, just to be clear, like going forward in this statement, but like knowing how people were supposed to interact and
Mm-hmm.
knowing how when I was showing up as a dom, how I could interact and like what the like assumed expectations were that like were not explained to me in the same way, and that
Yeah.
caused me like very intense distress trying to like figure them out that I like couldn't be present. And then as I stepped into a dominant role, and like I started off as a switch and like sort of like earned my leathers, but like both roles gave me comfort of knowing what I should be doing at any given moment, at least as a starting place. Like I didn't have to think about the infinite amount of possibilities. It was like narrowed the scope and like I could move from there. And I think for me, there's part of being a dom that allows me to like sort of like world build and like create the world that I want to see, both aesthetically and like I'm a hedonist, so like facilitate, that's like aimed in the direction of facilitating my pleasure and with people who want to please me. Like the like one thing that I like look for in partners, play partners, clients is that desire to please, and I feel like anything else can be worked around. Like I don't have super strong specific fetishes other than like seeing people's fetishes as access points into like moving them around in my world. And like I love that vulnerability of someone like allowing you into their brain and like allowing it to be malleable, and like that desire to sort of like fall as an object in your world for that like chance to share space with you. And so like I think there's something that's, yes, definitely about power that I feel like I should continually examine more. But I think there's something also that feels about control that feels slightly different for me, that like is just so many variables are already decided upon and like not necessarily negotiated, but it's just so many less options that I feel more comfortable like stepping into myself and stepping into relationship with other people with those like terms already kind of agreed upon, and then figuring out less.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that, like you said, that kind of having that direction from the start can be very freeing, exciting, whatever, however it really translates. I feel like it is interesting, this differentiation between power and control, because I think I'm sort of realizing, it's something I've been thinking through lately, that I think like the farther that I get into my practice as a dominant, I actually think in a lot of ways I enjoy having a sense of power and a sense of status in a scene. I don't really enjoy controlling people, actually. I don't enjoy micromanaging people. I don't really enjoy that kind of thing. I like people who kind of will willingly learn what I enjoy and kind of acquiesce to it and figure out how to fit themselves in it. And I really, the core of my practice really, when we get down to just like the nitty gritty of scenes, is usually about like intense physical experience and really somatic play, whether that's through bondage, through sadomasochism, whatever. I'm much more of a physical, I feel like I use the body to access the mind, not the other way. I almost never start with the psychological. I think breaking down, I think this is also a sort of false binary in our world between like psychological play and physical play. I think the mind and the body are connected, and emotion is always sort of comes up when you're dealing with the body, but I almost always start with that, with the sort of corporeal form of somebody. And if we want to unlock a certain emotion, that's usually done in a physical practice.
So. Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. I feel like I often will go top down, but I feel like it depends so much on the person. It's like I feel like whatever they have access to the most or the most control over, go with the other one. And like it's like when like I was like learning to throw a whip and I like was having trouble doing a certain throw with my right hand, the teacher's like, use your left one, the one that you're less skilled with, because you don't have the same muscle memory of doing it wrong. You don't have the memory of like not being able to access the thing that you want to. So you're freer with your non-dominant hand, or like there's more possibility with whatever like you're, if you like intellectualize or like
there's like less to unlearn.
What was that?
There's like less to unlearn there.
Yeah, and so I think there's like different approaches are super effective
totally.
for different people.
Yeah, for me, it really switched at some point. I think that the first few years when I was really started professionally doming, I had a lot of interest in psychological play. And it's not to say that I don't have interest in psychological play, but I think that the mechanism through which I get there is very, very different than it used to be. I'm usually extremely quiet in sessions. I don't speak much. Um, and that to me, again, I mean, I think this almost loops back to what I was saying in the very beginning, but I do find that, again, like removal of stimuli, being able to find something that is like, feels very quiet and very peaceful, even in dealing with intense physical sensation, to me, even just talking about it, I can like feel my body respond. Like that's like really what I seek. And I think that sometimes people get a little bit turned off by it, but if they trust the process, they enjoy it.
I can understand that. Well, I feel like there's something about how you talk about your practice that is that monotasking, and that I could see
Mm-hmm.
like verbalization to be a distraction at some point rather
Yeah.
than like adding something, which is it's interesting. I I feel like I get a lot of like, mommy, I have trauma sessions, which I
I can
actually like. What was
I
that?
can imagine that to be true.
Which I actually love. Like I love those like intense. I know some people don't really enjoy those, but like I love the intentionality with which my clients and submissives like approach wanting to like touch their wounds in a way that I find really beautiful. And then
Mm-hmm.
I also like love a meditative session, and I also like I can get like really verbal in a way where like I have no fucking idea what I just said. And my partner is my submissive and was going down on me, and like I guess I had my legs like clamped over her ears, and she's like, I had no fucking idea what you were saying, but I'm sure it was hot. And I'm like, don't worry about it, sweetie, like that was just
I have no idea what I was saying either.
I have no idea either. We'll have to record it next time so both of us can.
So we can listen back later.
No, this is like
Totally.
reflect.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, I think that that kind of like automatic speech, like I've seen that come out. Actually, Roxanne's a great example where I feel like whenever her and I double, it's really fascinating because I'm somebody who communicates so much just with, I feel like my main instrument of communication in a scene is my body and my touch and that kind of thing. Whereas she's somebody who also has this incredibly vivid imagination and incredibly vivid description of what is happening in a scene. And I feel like when the two of us play together, it's like, you're really getting it from all sides.
yeah.
But it's something that it never, that would never come out of me in that way almost ever. And I don't know, I don't really know why that is. I think in some ways, again, that for me, there's a relief in not having to externalize myself or my ideas. And I think now I'm going really deep, but whatever, we'll go there. I was recently having a conversation with my therapist about how I really feel like talk therapy is not working for me and how, I think that for me and the wounds that I carry and how I work through things, often there's such a relief in not having to verbalize and actually being able to just experience catharsis in my body without um, logic
Yeah.
that comes with speech for me anyway. I think I'm somebody that I can have a high level of self-consciousness about what I say and often reflect back on it and like, so I think that for me, I think that the people that I play with, there is still this experiencing of potentially working with trauma or whatever else. I mean, it's certainly not required, but it may come up. But I think that, I actually feel like being allowed to be alone in that or experience that just within yourself without needing to explain, I think that can actually be very therapeutic. And yeah, I don't know. That's something that I feel like I've been thinking about recently.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like it also like, well, I think there's something about like being seen and heard in the way that you want. And it also sounds like, I don't know if this is your experience, but it sounds like you're externalizing something in a way that feels most like comfortable and like to go back to our word, authentic for
Yeah,
you in a way that you like don't feel like you have to be performing what you think like
right,
is what is for someone else. You get to
right.
like be embodied and like use your body somatically to dominate. And I think that's like such a form of power. But I also think like when I was talking about like sessions like going in through the head if people are in the body, or going in through the body if people are in the head, I feel like it makes total sense. And I feel like there's like so much hierarchy of like talk therapy being like the thing to do. And it's like, what? You're not in therapy? Like, you're not doing work on yourself, or like you're not seeing this like accredited person who like is charging $300 an hour to like not tell you you'll ever get better. But like I do think like talk therapy and like psychoanalysis is like put on this like fucking like pedestal of like, this is what you need to achieve like self-knowledge and like move with like more grace in your relationships. And it's just like, it does not work for some people. And like I think it does such a disservice how like reified like talk therapy is, when there are so many different ways to move something in your body and like be in relationship with your wounds and your trauma. And like it just goes back like every like culture, many cultures, I guess I'll say, so I don't globalize, have like very ancient somatic practices that have like nothing to do with talk, whether it be like dance or yoga or like flagellation, of like getting something out of the body, like singing, chanting, that are like so powerful. It's so, I'm recovering from long COVID right now, and the first thing my physical therapist taught me was to like remind me how to breathe. So I'm doing like pranayama, I'm breathing, I'm chanting to like engage my diaphragm, and it's changing my heart rate. And I'm like, I'm also a trained yoga teacher, so like I know some of these things, but I think seeing it in practice in like a medical context where they like don't have more like Western medical answers, I just feel like there's so much with the body and so many other ways to do things other than talking, that it just makes so much sense that there's like these different styles of domination that different people would be drawn to for the experience that they want. Because I am sure like an incredibly verbal dom is going to bring people out of certain people like out of their own, out of their headspace. And I think, I don't know, that's why it's so interesting having these conversations with people and like learning about their different domination styles, because I feel like, yeah, it's just so fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, I feel like I want to make a caveat, which is that I feel like both of us are talking sort of about BDSM in parallel with different forms of different practices of mental health care. We're not insinuating that the two are equal in any way. But yeah, I think that for me, again, like allowing for this is something that I think comes up in my life a lot, but I almost feel like in a power dynamic for me, there's actually a lot of allowance for intimacy with privacy, allowing the two parties to have their own kind of separate experience. But that, one sort of balances the other, one necessitates the other. Like they don't really exist independently, although they are not bound in the same space, which is interesting to me. And I think for whatever reason really works for me to let go of a lot of my own self-consciousness. And I think for the people that I work with, I think that that's true as well.
Yeah, I feel like there's so many ways to have sex or like be vulnerable or like share space, and I feel like we're like taught this like very normative way that is just like also not necessarily accessible
Yeah.
or interesting to everyone. And especially like I really relate to what you're talking about with like intimacy with privacy. I do feel like the like boundariedness of like the dominant persona is part of what I like about it so much, and like both being able to like move within it and like transgress it like when I want, rather than it being like an assumption from me of like that is necessitated for intimacy. But yeah. And I also like, I wasn't necessarily talking about BDSM as a therapeutic practice right then. I was thinking about yoga, but I both agree with you that it is not therapy and we're not mental health professionals and that should not be put on us. And I also know from experience that, BDSM can be incredibly therapeutic, and that people who like clients, I have had many clients who have been in talk therapy for years And when something came up with us in a session, it like completely transformed their
Right.
relationship to their body in a way that like analysis had not been able to do. And like they took that to analysis and like continued that work in a way that had felt stymied, because like if you're not in your body, there's only so much talking about it can do. And like hitting someone back into their body is like honestly a pretty effective tool. And like I both don't want to conflate BDSM with therapy, but I also don't want to like undersell it as something that can like have the like profound potential for transformation and
Yeah.
healing.
Yeah, I definitely co-sign that. And I think, I mean, I say this all the time, even just within my own journey, but I have found nothing to be as healing as like maintaining different physical practices for myself. And I think that, I have my own ways that for me, certain ways that I like to challenge my body or push my body. It doesn't come out in my sexual practice necessarily, or like in terms of submission, but like I completely, when I see people going through it and craving these deep experiences within that context, I completely understand it. And it feels very akin to, different ways that I like to experience my body in different settings.
Yeah, I feel like it's like it all like ties back to like that ritual and just like
Mm-hmm.
how you want to play with it and how you want to engage with it, and is it like in this context or is it in another. And I think there's something really interesting too of the the top down approach of like being like in film school and it like influencing like fetish and like how you approach that, and then like having like a very embodied like BDSM practice that's
Mm-hmm.
like it sounds like what your photos look like this like stillness and like monotasking. And I think that really is like interesting to hear you talk about it in detail, because I feel like I don't know that I would have had the language for that, but like seeing the photos that you share, I feel some of that in it.
Yeah, totally. And for me, it's interesting because I feel like a lot of this has been, and this is very, I feel like this is true of a lot of parts of my life. None of it is like really anything that I planned. Like when I was in school, even my focuses were mainly on experimental filmmaking and narrative. Um, but I find myself more and more tied up in projects that involve documentary and um, that don't involve any elements of scripting or anything like that. Even though that was what I was kind of trained in. Um, so I think that again, I have found myself just kind of pulled towards it, and here I am.
Makes sense. Okay, as we wrap up, I won't ask you another question about imaginary Trinity as a fascist.
Thank you.
Uh, you're welcome. But I would love to know if you have any advice for people who are interested in adding like photography into their play or like taking sexy photos for themselves. I feel like um it can be so cathartic and lovely to like figure out what your angles are and like get the lighting right, and like
Mhm.
being able to translate either what like how you see yourself in your head accurately on film, or like something that makes you feel self-conscious in person like feel really beautiful
Yeah, totally.
on camera.
Advice. Yeah, I mean, the first piece of advice that I'll give that I think is like an essential, I think it's an essential misunderstanding. I think, first of all, I feel like I've been doing this whole interview, but I really challenge this binary of like, there's artists and there's not artists, right? Like, I think that that's really stupid. But I think people who see themselves on the outside of that dichotomy, I feel like one thing to really understand about anybody who makes anything is that it's made in the edit. It's like 90% of everything that any person will shoot is like shit, and that's what it is. So that's the first thing to know. Like, just do it and look at it later and allow yourself to be surprised by it later.
It's that subtractive
Um,
quality that you were talking about, of like paring
yeah,
back how much you
right,
could.
exactly. So it's like, I think a lot of times it's easy to take a few, it's like, I think actually people are maybe becoming more aware of this. It's like the thing where you want to get a good selfie, so you need to take like 100 and then you like one, it's like that is the metric that we're working with. So I think that like, I actually think that photographing on analog film can be really fun a really fun exercise for this specifically because you actually cannot look at the result until later. So it forces a separation between you and the product at the end. Because I remember I had this film professor in college, and I actually do kind of agree with her, although this is almost impossible to do functionally, where she had a really strict thing where she was like, do not let actors watch playback on set. Do not let them do it because they'll start thinking about what they look like, and that is bad. And again, I don't think that, even when someone's shooting me, I ask to look, and it's kind of, you need to do it. But
like, show me, move your hands, go like this. This is my angle.
Like allowing yourself as like a human body in that moment to be separated from the whatever you're trying to create, I think is important. And I also think, a lot of what I shoot, I also think like, well, I think a few things. One, investing in a camera that you actually like the look of is extremely important. I still shoot things on I'll shoot stuff on my iPhone and I almost never post it because I just think that camera, the texture, the tone, all of that, I do not like it. And something about it never has that thing that makes it good to me. So get some kind of visual system that you really like what it's outputting without too much work. And I also think, I think that really like setting and forgetting a camera, letting it run, and then being able to just look through it later, pick an angle that's interesting, not necessarily just a wide shot that shows everything. Like make a choice, have a point of view, be like, okay, I want this close up of, maybe a very limited point of view, and let yourself be surprised by the outcome later. A lot of what I post is stills from videos and stuff like that, because I don't always, as much as I do like to photograph my scenes, there is a tension for me in this like stepping between the two roles, and sometimes being able to just let the camera roll and know that I'll probably miss some things, but I'll probably capture some things I wasn't even thinking about, can be the best approach.
I love that. I have one right here with their name written on it, but I often will get disposable cameras for sessions and give it to a client after, and have like a kink friendly photographer, like a developer that I recommend them to, or like Polaroids. But I think there's something really nice about like not having that immediate judgment of yourself.
Exactly.
And, like, I also think like iPhones are incredibly powerful cameras that look best further than you can hold it from yourself. Like with the like way the like zoom or the lens or whatever is working, like you actually like want to be like 6 feet away from an iPhone camera to get like the most flattering angle, and that's not how we most often use iPhone cameras. So it's also like just not an accurate representation of what we look like or like how other people see us. And I think that film is also like kind of like much more akin to like a human eye, where like not everything is in focus. There's like some like nice grain, like we're not like super focusing on like one blemish on our face that the iPhone like decided to like increase the like contrast of, or just like, like zoom in on or something. And I one of my suggestions is also like work with natural light. Like find your best facing window, find when the light is good, because one thing I love to do on like my fan sites is like help people take good selfies, because I'm like, okay, if you're going to be sending me dick pics, if you're going to be sending me like slutty
beautiful dick pic,
like, I want to see a fucking gorgeous composition, beautiful lighting. Take it before the sun goes down.
That golden ratio going.
The golden ratio. Perfect. And like play with natural light. Like I think people really try and get a lot out of nothing, not themselves, but like, like a clear background does a lot. Like having a natural, like having something well lit does so much heavy lifting, and so much is about that. I think you're so right in that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that would be my main advice. Just do it. Basically.
There's something so powerful about taking photos of yourself too, and like feeling good about them.
And I think also the last thing I'll say, I guess, on this point is like, I also think that like challenge like whatever notions you have of like what taking a sexy photo is. Like, I think that this is actually like a pet theory that I have, which this is actually, I feel like, what I hinge a lot of my content on, is that, I think that, again, there's a lot of really hardcore and gratuitous content out there, which is great for its own, its own purpose. But I think also, like, to me, what is actually erotic is often what isn't seen and what is implied, what, a where like how the negative space of what you're not seeing can actually become the world that the viewer imbues with their own self, right? I remember I had a new submissive to me once like tell me that one thing that they really loved about my photos is that like they weren't just photos of me, they were often photos of submissives, and the submissives were often, almost always, hooded, and it was easy to see themselves step into that role and into that practice. And I think that that's something that is, is interesting, because I think a lot of times when we think about marketing ourselves as doms, as sex workers, whatever, it's like, you think about selling your image and all of that. But I think that, just as much, I think people are kind of hungry to see an image that looks beautiful and has a thing that they could see themselves in, that is lifted up and exalted in a certain way. And I think even in a state of sort of degraded objectification, you can view that with a beauty and a pride. And that's what I try to do through my photography.
I love it. I mean, what's more beautiful than degradation?
Nothing, literally.
Perfect ending, please. Well, if people want to find you and see some of your photography and work, where would they do that?
I post very, very frequently on Twitter, for better or for worse, which my username there is Serve Trinity. I also, my preferred paid platform is Loyal Fans, which is the same username at Serve Trinity. And then I have a contact form with nothing else currently, because I'm rebuilding my website, but I'm responsive on my email, which is servetrinity.com. So if you want to inquire about anything, that is the right place to do it.
Amazing. And if you want to find me, Google Mistress Blunt, because who knows what platform is going down.
Yes.
Down. For posterity, just Google me. Amazing. Thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation.
Yes, thank you so much. Thanks for having me.